this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. Today we are exploring a topic that doesn't get talked about much: the British tanks that ended up serving with the Red Army during the Second World War. We often think about the Soviet Union producing huge numbers of their own tanks like the T-34, but in the early years of the war and even before, the Soviets were looking abroad for armoured vehicles to strengthen their forces. Britain, with its long history of tank development stretching back to the First World War, was one of the first countries they turned to. Joining me today is Peter Samsonov, who's spent a lot of time researching Soviet armoured warfare and is the author of British Tanks of the Red Army. Peter, thanks for joining me. Shall we kick off by looking at those years before the Second World War? Did the Soviets have a shopping list of British tanks they were interested in? Were they keeping tabs on what British manufacturers and even those private companies were designing and selling?
It's not like today where only more or less governments build tanks. You could go out and buy yourself an army if you could afford it. You had tons and tons of companies working both for their own army or the export market, and in some cases, particularly in the 1930s, when the financial situation in the whole world, wasn't exactly great. Some companies, Landsverk is a very good example, did more business with external purchasers than they did with their own army. And that's what kept them afloat. And in particularly, Vickers, a very well-known company for the time, very famous by that point, built the exceptional Mark E, or Vickers 6-tonner. The British Army didn't want it. Now, I haven't particularly researched that direction very far. I don't know why they didn't want it. But fortunately for Vickers, lots of other people did. For its time, it was very fast. We might think after Christie tanks became popular, a tank needs to go 70 kilometers an hour, 80 kilometers an hour. It really doesn't. There's very few paved highways or landing strips in war. The suspension of the Vickers tank allowed it to comfortably maintain a speed 25 to 30 kilometers, even off-road. And it was smooth enough you could still fire when driving off-road. So very good combination of mobility for the time, mobility and firepower. Only 2 machine guns in 2 turrets, which seems really archaic by 1941. But in the late 1920s, this was a very popular solution because what you would do is you would drive on top of a trench, point one machine gun one way, one machine gun the other way, and sweep through it. So very good tank, very famous in the export market. There's no way that Soviet purchasers would have been able to ignore it. And of course, it was one of the vehicles that was purchased along with the license when they went abroad to look for new tank designs to buy in 1930.
It's funny, is it, to think that there's sort of a shopping list that these people go around to third parties such as Vickers looking for things. Presumably, though, after the Russian occupation of Poland in 1939, there's no exports, and presumably at the same time, Britain are wanting to hang on to what we've got. So when Germany invades in 1941 and my enemy's enemy becomes my friend, did Russia come to the Britain saying, can we have aid, can we have tanks? Or is it the other way around, Britain going, we've got this shopping list. Would you like some of these? Would you like some of our wares?
So the Soviet Union, they actually reached out to France and the UK to form an alliance back in, I can't remember if it was 38 or 39. So when Hitler kicked down the doors in 41, naturally, the whole process kind of restarted again. And the British were at first very reluctant to give them anything for 2 very practical reasons. Well, 3. One is that the defeated Dunkirk left the British without much heavy equipment. Of course, they rescued all the men, which is, you can't just build a new soldier at a factory in a couple of weeks, but you need to replace the whole tank fleet somehow. By that time, they were already fighting the Germans in North Africa pretty actively. These tanks had already somewhere to go. The tanks had somewhere to go. The threat of the German invasion of the British Isles was still very much not forgotten. So even in 42 and less so in 43, this was still considered the serious operations that the Germans might undertake. And so anything at all that wasn't being sent to North Africa or the colonies would have to be retained for use in the home isles. The second reason is that even if they had surplus, if it was sent to the USSR, the fear was that Moscow would fold in a month or two, and then you're just sending more tanks to the Germans for them to use. Nobody wanted to do that. There's no point in making your enemy stronger by backing a pointless fight. Probably the feelings of Greece the memory of Greece was still very, very fresh, and they didn't want a repeat of that. And then third reasons were financial. For some reason, British aid to the USSR gets lumped in with Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease was entirely an American program. The British ledgers were not quite as balanced as those of the Americans. And so they were looking for financial help to conduct the war from the U.S. They couldn't really afford to give handouts. And that's why the first tanks, even when the USSR actually started receiving aid from Britain, they were paid for in gold and in raw materials. Nothing was free. The British extended a credit of, I think it was £10 million. But for the first couple of months, at the very least, it was very much cash and carry with the Soviet Union.
That's fascinating because you're right. It just gets lumped with Lend-Lease, and then you start to think about all those American trucks and spam, and it just gets swept up in. Of course, it's Lend-Lease, and which is much more complicated. So when it came to tanks, did Russia get a choice, or was it dusting off its 1930s shopping list? And going through what might or might not work, or are the British just saying, we've got these, you can have them?
It's sort of a balance. Even though Britain and the USSR were allies at this point, Soviet intelligence was still operating in the UK. And Soviet government received information, here's all these tanks the British have, all the types. This information was not very precise, but you could still identify, okay, that looks like a Matilda, that looks like a cruiser tank Mark III. And so the Soviet government had some time to think about it and choose even before the British offered anything. Some tanks were just straight up considered unacceptable, particularly all of the cruisers, which sounds weird because the cruiser tanks evolved from exactly the same lineage as the Soviet BT series. 1941, the BT tank was still considered quite useful. I mean, the BT tanks fought until 1945, with the last of them going into battle against the Japanese in Manchuria.
The cruisers are the fast punch breakthrough sort of tanks, aren't they? They're kind of cavalry. We're through. Press on.
Yeah, breakthrough exploitation.
Yes, exploitation.
Fairly small gun, fairly thin armor, but the idea is you're surprising the enemy. They don't have time to deploy their anti-tank guns, so you're in pretty good shape, even if you don't have very thick armor. But the one thing that the Soviets really didn't like was the Liberty engine. They were fed up with it from the mid-30s, both to domestically produced copies and the actual ones that were purchased from the US. It was way too flammable. It got to the point where it was prescribed officially to have somebody with a fire extinguisher standing by when the tank was being started. So it was replaced on the BT tanks with the M17 and then the V2 engine. And when then they saw that the British were still using the old Liberties, they said, no way. Please leave these at home. We don't want them. We don't need them. And that included the Crusader, that included the Covenanter, that included the Centaur. Anything with the Liberty engine was immediately a no-go. It was kind of reciprocal where the British did say, here we have a whole bunch of these tanks that we're not using. Do you want them? The Tetrarch was on that list. Tetrarch being an airborne tank. Of course, the British weren't carrying out that many airborne operations in 41. So a batch of 20 tanks was sent to the USSR. It was the first and last batch. They did not really come in handy. They were sent to down south to patrol the border with Turkey. They didn't see any fighting until 1943, but all the reports that came from the people using them, even in relatively peaceful conditions, said, like, hey, this thing, the armor is way too thin. It can be penetrated by rifle bullets. If you get a crowbar, you can kind of crack it open. The tracks slip on wet roads. It's nice and fast. The use case they came up with for it was pursuit of a retreating enemy when the most you might face is an ambush by submachine gunners, not even riflemen. Very specific. No more tanks of that type were ordered. It was only the 20 that came in the original batch. But then most famously, the Valentine and the Matilda, those tanks started coming in. I think the first ship came in very early October or end of September. And those tanks were much more useful. So weight-wise, the Matilda at 25 tons matched the weight of Soviet medium tanks, and armor-wise as well. Armament, not so much. The 40 millimeter 2-pounder gun was considered to be a suitable weapon for a light tank, not so much a medium one. And there was a list of issues with the Matilda. But most importantly, this was a tank that was here, it was now, and it worked most of the time. And in the Battle of Moscow, that's kind of what you needed. The Valentine was treated much more favorably. It was at 16 tons considered a light tank as well, and it had armament to match. And the armor was very good for a light tank. So the tank the Soviets would compare it to would be their own T-50. The T-50 also weighed about 16 tons, but it had thinner armor at 45 millimeters. It was heavily sloped, but it was thinner than the Valentine's armor. But very, very few of them were available because of how manufacturing didn't really get off the ground by the time the war started. So the Valentine was a very, very welcome addition to the Soviet tank fleet, particularly because they worked more often than the Matilda did. There were, of course, some drawbacks. The running gear was very strange. The idea with 2 bogies, the Soviets discarded back with the T-26, but it worked. It didn't do too badly even in snow, even in the winter. And so there is a document that I have that I translated in my book where in all caps it says, "The Valentine is a good tank."
The bit that jumped out about me when you mentioned snow there, and the Soviets would drive them into snow walls. And the Matilda took 21 minutes to get over it. I didn't note down. The Valentine took about 10 minutes or something to get over the snow.
It was
the T-34 took 10 seconds.
Yeah. Well, the T-34, more powerful engine, bigger tank, more momentum. But it is kind of interesting. Yes, in the book, there's a whole section about winter warfare and how tanks negotiate both natural and artificial obstacles. Because in addition to the kind of obstacles that you think of when fighting tanks, the big anti-tank hedgehogs, minefields, barbed wire obstacles, you can also just dig a really big hole. If you don't have anything but a shovel, you can still always dig a hole. In winter, you can build a wall of snow, pack it really tight, and you think, well, if you think of a snowman or something, how's that a serious obstacle for any motor vehicle? Well, if you build the wall big enough and thick enough, if it's a 3-meter thick wall, it might take a while to build, but again, if you have absolutely nothing to defend yourself than a shovel, this is a serious obstacle in front of a tank. And the idea, of course, isn't to stop it permanently. It's to discourage the enemy from maneuvering, slow them down, make them pick another direction for their attack that you do have protected with real anti-tank weapons.
It's interesting talking about the weather because clearly British winters are extremely mild compared to Russian winters. Is that a problem for British tank design? Do the British tank designers even really consider the extremes that they would face in Russia? Because the extremes are just chalk and cheese.
Yeah, the tanks, I highly doubt they considered for the Valentine and the Matilda. The Matilda specifically, with the side skirts, the biggest problem was that snow and ice would pack in there. Things get colder at night. The slush that was trapped between the skirt and the main armor would freeze, and the tank would be immobilized, and you would have to wait for it to melt or chip it out until it could move again. Fairly big issue. That's why one of the reasons the Matilda was not as well liked as the Valentine. The Valentine had its own problem in that I think we're all very familiar with overheating, but the Valentine's engine suffered from overcooling because the cooling system was tuned to the weather that it would fight in, either in the UK or in Egypt or something like that. When it's minus 40 outside, it doesn't really work that well. Rather, it works too well. And the way the Valentine fighting compartment is ventilated, there's actually like a little pocket in the back of the turret to draw in air. And so when the engine is running, the air is circulating through the tank continuously, which might be nice in the summer when it's warm. In the winter, that means the crew is subjected to a constant draft of cold air just as long as the tank engine is running, which is unpleasant, as you can imagine. So they would actually cover up the cooling system. They would cover up the inlets to make it work less efficiently so that the tank was actually warm enough to operate in the winter. But by the time the Churchill tank was really getting off the ground, production began in 1941. It was plagued with all sorts of issues. It was really by 1942 that the British even considered sending it anywhere else in the world. They actually sent 2 of them to Canada to test. They wanted -40 weather. The documents straight up say, hey, it just didn't get that cold this winter. Sorry, guys. But the Canadians came up with all the lubricants and all the procedures required to get the tank running in winter. I'm actually not sure that anything the Canadians came up with ever made it to the USSR, because by the time that the trials were done and the reports were finished and approved and written up, the Churchill was already in service with the Red Army. Generally, the exchange of information was pretty open. Even though the Soviets never got a Churchill Mark I, there's a list of all the defects. And it's a lengthy list because the Mark I was born in very, very difficult times. There's a list of defects that was sent to the USSR just saying, hey, we're sending you this tank. It's not perfect. Look out for these things. The British tankers got a similar list where they were kind of warned, like, hey, your tank has some issues. The remanufactured ones had fewer issues. The British were generally very honest about the quality of their equipment, where it's a good tank, has a big gun, it has thick armor, there's a bit of an asterisk, here's all the things that are wrong with it. If you work around them, they can be used in great effect in battle, but you have to be aware of the drawbacks of your equipment to work around those drawbacks.
I'm intrigued by, you just brought up Canada, how the British shipped the Churchill to Canada. We're calling these British tanks, as usual, with the idea of them being Britain doing anything. It's Britain and the Commonwealth. A large number of tanks were built in Canada, and so we should really call them British design tanks, because the tanks coming from Canada, I don't know how many what the split between tanks were from Canada and Britain. My assumption, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me more tanks were shipped from Canada than from Britain. Did the Canadians make any design changes when they are producing tanks rather than the ones built in Britain?
There were some minor changes. The British tank that went into production in Canada was the Valentine. Valentine 6 was a copy of the Valentine 4. So it was a Valentine tank, 2-man turret, 2-pounder gun. It had the American diesel engine, so 1/2 of the engine that was being used in the Sherman tank. The Canadian one at first was, as far as I'm aware, pretty much identical. Rather than adapting it to existing factories, the Canadians had very little in terms of heavy industry. So the British actually invested a lot of money into Canadian tank factories. And so in doing so, they could get the equipment to build the Valentine specifically. They didn't need to be adapted. Very few Mark 6s were built before they switched to Mark 7. In the Mark 7, the only difference is the machine gun is different. The Browning machine gun is used rather than the British Bessa. And that makes sense because the Americans are right there. You can just go down to the south and order some new Brownings as opposed to waiting for a shipment of Bessas to come from the UK and then ship them back with the tanks. It doesn't really make sense. There was a lot of debate about, do we need to have multiple ammo types, multiple gun types? And the conclusion was that even British demand can't keep up with Bessa production. They're going to have to use Brownings in British tanks anyway. Might as well do the switch now. And then we get to the Mark 7A. The Mark 7A is fairly similar to the Mark 7. The biggest change was the front. The British were still assembling tanks with rivets, which was a bit of an archaic solution. The Canadians did not like that, but they didn't have time to come up with anything better. By 1941, by 1943, armor casting was particularly advanced in Canada. And so the Valentine 7A had a cast front rather than a riveted one. Rivets were still used in the assembly, but this is how you can tell you're looking at a Canadian tank, is the front of the hull is rounded and there's no rivets right on the kind of on the nose.
When the Russians are getting these tanks, do they make requests for modifications, or do they just get what they're given? Presumably, they must have a list of modifications that fit their requirements.
There was a very active exchange of feedback between the end users and the British mission and the American mission. Requirements pretty much started coming in immediately. One of the things that the Soviets wanted was high explosive ammunition. So both fused armor piercing and just straight up high explosive fragmentation. And the British said, we don't have it. Sorry, guys, we don't have it. The British themselves were using solid shot for the 2-pounder. High explosive ammunition would not be fielded until 1944 or thereabouts. Soviet intelligence actually dug up blueprints of the old pre-World War II fused 2-pounder AP, and there was a scandal over it where the Soviet side said, hey, we know you have this ammunition, you're not giving it to us. The British didn't. It just was not in production anymore. It was fairly brittle. It had a tendency to sort of disintegrate before it actually penetrated enemy armor, and that's why they switched to solid shot, and they were only making solid shot. So eventually there was shipments of the Matilda close support tank, which featured a 76mm howitzer that somewhat mitigated the need for a high explosive shell. The howitzer itself wasn't entirely satisfactory, but you kind of have to balance what you have with what you want. There was a project to put a 45mm Soviet gun into a Valentine and a 76mm gun into a Matilda. They built one version of each, and then the natural question came up, is where are you going to get the guns, and where are you going to get the workshops? We don't have extra guns, and we don't have extra men, and the Germans are 50 kilometers from Moscow, so what are you going to do? And, of course, you can have all these great ideas, and you can have a prototype that's really shiny and slick and polished, but at some point you're going to hit the wall of harsh reality, and reality says, well, here's a laundry list of requirements that you need to put this tank into production. If you don't meet them, then there's nothing you can do. So for all of the faults of the Valentine tank and the Matilda tank and the Churchill tank, they saw service with the Red Army in unmodified states.
When they arrive, even when they first start arriving, do the Russians literally just start using them, or is there some sort of proving process where they figure out what they've got, they start training crews? I mean, because in my head, you sort of think the Russian army just sort of get on with it. We haven't got time, get on with it. But my assumption is with tanks, they are a technical piece of kit. Somebody has to figure out how they work.
Absolutely. If you take a crew that's entirely untrained and put them in a tank, that's a great way to get a broken tank. Many people compare a tank to a sledgehammer just because it's big and heavy. I would say a tank is more like a scalpel. It needs to be maintained. Nick on the blade will ruin the whole thing. You need to, after you use them, take them, wash them, disinfect them. There's this whole maintenance procedure that is not entirely obvious when you first look at it. And so British instructors came to the USSR, British manuals were translated. A training center was set up in Gorky where these tanks were received and went to the QA process. So that's why, even though the first British tanks began to arrive in October, it wasn't really until very late November, early December that they saw the front lines. And even then, the program to train tankers was very, very accelerated. Usually, unfortunately, you would be in a situation where maybe the commander had gone through the training school, but the crewmen got very rudimentary training, a couple of hours of driving, and that's it. In Soviet tanks, the British tank would be new to them. This was kind of a complaint throughout the war, where not restricted to British tanks, unfortunately. Crewmen did not have time to train in the tanks they would be using, so there was a bit of a learning curve when they got to the battlefield. And if you're preparing for a major offensive, like, you know when it's coming, you can take the time to train in the field. Battle of Moscow, the Germans are right there. You kind of have to put the tanks in battle when you do get them. So, but there were 3 or 4 battalions of British tanks already taking part in the tail end of the defensive battle, and then also 3 or 4 battalions taking part in the offensive part of the Battle of Moscow, in the counteroffensive. that pushed the Germans back. So the tanks, due to this accelerated kind of training, did get onto the battlefield in time. But the urgent nature, the expedited nature of this training, it's demonstrated by the fact that there were no other British or American tanks that would show up in the battlefield until the spring of 1942. So there's quite a big gap in between this kind of first burst of foreign tanks and the second burst, where they took the time to do things properly, to train the crews, to go through the manuals, to identify all of the technical defects, because there were technical defects. You can't really scale up production to wartime needs without taking some shortcuts, without making some sacrifices. And that almost always is going to impact quality.
Were the British shipping full spares kits as well? Because presumably it's not just kits, presumably it's tools, because presumably the tanks are all using imperial measurement tools and the Russians are all metric, which is even more confusing and slightly annoying, presumably for the Russian mechanics with 2 sets of spanners.
Oh, absolutely. The British were shipping spares, but they weren't nearly enough. For example, you would get 3 or 4 spare track pins with every tank. You would get 1 spare barrel per 10 tanks. And that's if you got the parts. Oftentimes, there were comments saying that the tanks arrived, their toolboxes are empty. Where are the tools? We don't know. They could be in a different box. They could be on a different ship. They could still be in Scapa Flow, right? They're somewhere, maybe, but we don't know where they are. As time went on, they kind of figured out all of these logistics. It's one of those things that it's not obvious to somebody who's never worked in shipping or somebody who's just a complete kind of civilian. It's really easy to go to the post office and mail somebody one thing. It's really hard to take production of 10,000 of that thing, package it all up, and send it out all over the world. That's a whole separate logistical operation. And if you're just starting out and you and your receivers are speaking a different language, and the ships that are delivering all these packages are being shot at and sunk all the time, there are going to be some things that need to be worked out just with time. Especially in recent years, the topic of foreign aid to the USSR has become controversial. Again, you have people looking at these early years and saying, oh, look at how bad all these tanks were and how bad the British were at shipping them to us. This is intentional sabotage. They didn't even really contribute at all. And then you have people looking at 1944 and saying, look at these beautiful, perfect Valentines arriving in the USSR through Iran. No saltwater damage, no mechanical trouble. These tanks are awesome. They were exactly this awesome in 1941. And both sides are wrong. The condition of the tanks arriving in 1941, the mechanical condition, how many just completeness. Some tanks would arrive with no turrets. Some tanks would arrive with no electrical equipment. Completely different from 1941 to 1944. And of course, the tanks themselves were improved throughout the war. So considerable changes to the process, to the shipping lanes, to pretty much anything around delivering these tanks by the time that shipments ended.
It'd be interesting to compare that with the Middle East to see how tanks shipped to the British Army in the Middle East arrived in incompleteness with bits missing and stuff not there. But it must be more awkward. It amused me thinking about the tools. It must be more awkward for the Russians not getting a full toolkit, because I presume as well, even things down to the nuts and bolts will be the different size, different threads. Just the little small details, but they must be extremely frustrating when you've got something that looks right and it's not quite, and you end up kind of trying to jerry-rig it in.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where I do research in British archives as well, and it was exactly the same. Shipping tanks to North Africa, the parts aren't where you expect them to be. There's saltwater damage. They weren't packed properly. Whether the tank is British or American, you can see the exact same complaints in the English language in this archive and in the Russian language in this archive. And you can kind of see the Americans trying to make excuses in both cases, but if two different countries are seeing the exact same error, then the error is probably originating with the manufacturer rather than the end user.
So by the summer of 42, 10 to 20% of tanks used by the Russians are British. It's an enormous percentage of tanks, which presumably you don't hear about, because I think there's a certain strange nationalism to tanks. So you don't want to don't necessarily want to talk about them. But how are they performing on the battlefield against the Germans in sort of that middle of the war period?
It really depends on what they're fighting. In 41, when their main enemies are Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, they're in pretty good shape. I mean, the 2-pounder can't penetrate the front of the latest models, so 50 millimeters of solid armor can't penetrate it except at very, very close range. The sides, perfectly fine. And of course, the Germans didn't come to fight with only new models. There are older tanks with only 30 millimeters of front armor. You can penetrate that as well. Some older tanks were modernized by welding on or bolting on another 30 millimeter thick piece of armor. That armor generally fell apart when you hit it a couple of times. So even the 2-pounder gun was still fairly competitive in 1941. 42, 43, you see modernizations of the Panzer III, Panzer IV for better, thicker armor. The 2-pounder gun becomes obsolete. Of course, you can still use it against armored cars and kind of weaker vehicles, but against the newest, latest enemy tanks specifically, it's ineffective. The Valentine could be upgraded with the 6-pounder gun. The Churchill came with a 6-pounder gun, so the 6-pounder was roughly equivalent to the Soviet Zis-2 anti-tank gun, which was also 57 millimeters. Those remained useful until the end of the war, but the Matilda didn't, and that's one of the reasons why the Matilda was no longer ordered in 1943, even though it would still see battle. So in the Battle of Kursk, Matilda tanks were still being used, for example. By 1944, when you're comparing the Valentine, the Matilda, to the T-34-85, to the IS-2, you really can't compare them. I mean, the British tanks look kind of pale in comparison, and they're starting to taper off orders. By 44, the only tanks that are arriving are the Valentines, and even then, these tanks aren't being sent to the same units that they would be sent to originally. They weren't being sent to tank brigades. They were being sent to cavalry units. They're being sent to reconnaissance units, that sort of thing, where the whole idea is you take any tank and put it in places where the enemy expects you to have no tanks, rather than send them face-to-face to fight tigers and panthers.
Folks, we're going to pause it there. We'll be back in a moment. How are the Russians using British tanks? We said this at the start. The Russians seem to like the British infantry tanks, which were built as tanks to use with infantry. So there's a very specific doctrine the British thought of how they were going to use tanks. Do the Russians have a similar sort of doctrine to drop these tanks into? Or are they just sort of putting them in with T-34s, mixed units? I mean, how do the Russians use them?
There were mixed units at first, but that's just sort of in the chaos of 1941. You have a tank regiment that has like 3 T-34s and then 10 T-60s and then 1 T-50 and then, some BT-7s you found in the backyard. By 1942, things to kind of begin stabilizing, and you would have one type of tank being used at the very least in a battalion. So 3 battalions to a brigade. British tank units were usually augmented with T-60. So T-60 is a small tank. It's not even a light tank by Soviet classification. It's one step lower than that to kind of mop up enemy infantry. But the Soviets were fairly advanced in terms of combined arms warfare. At the very least, the theory of combined arms warfare didn't really work out so well in practice in 1941. 1942, you start seeing motorized rifle brigades where you would have organic tank assets alongside with the motorized infantry, mechanized infantry. British tanks were used generally in these types of units. Around this time, you also see formation of breakthrough brigades, breakthrough regiments. So these were heavy tanks. Not a lot of infantry, not a lot of anti-air assets. The whole idea is you take this unit, you attach it to something else, and it's used as kind of the spearhead, the tip of the breakthrough. It doesn't need to fight a 500-kilometer long kind of penetration attack. It just needs to break through the line. somebody else enters the breakthrough, usually with cavalry tanks, as we mentioned before. T-34s were used for this purpose. And then these tanks the British tanks or the heavy tanks can stick around and refit. And Churchill tanks worked perfectly for this role. So Churchill tanks were the only tanks to be issued exclusively to Guards heavy tanks units. Exactly like the KV-1, exactly like the KV-1S, exactly like the IS-2. Only foreign tank to receive that honor.
Because the odd thing about the British tanks is they're really slow compared to, if you look at the T-34, the British tanks run at half the speed of these infantry tanks. The visions of all the Russian tanks sort of leaving them behind, or the Russians have to slow down for the British tanks.
Yeah, that was something that was noted in the instructions, is you need to keep in mind that these tanks don't drive as fast. If you have a unit that's mixed, you need to keep in mind, these tanks you need to wait for them. You can't just go at full speed. The mitigating factor is that tanks very rarely can afford to drive at full speed. As I mentioned before, very few highways in the battlefield. If you do have highways, they're usually reserved for wheeled traffic. Tanks usually go off-road. And when you're going off-road, in very bumpy terrain, your suspension's going up and down. It's hitting the suspension stop, not really absorbing the impacts as well. If you're going at max speed at 50 kilometers an hour, you're going to lose all your teeth. So generally, the average speed moving off-road is on the order of 20, 25 kilometers an hour, which was something that the British tanks could achieve. And so while the top speed, the flanking speed, would be higher for Soviet tanks and, most other tanks, the average speed of the British tanks was actually comparable. It was lower, but it was lower by only a few kilometers an hour. So if you're advancing, let's say, in the second echelon with Valentines, it's not going to hold up the first echelon that much. And so the tanks could be used effectively in these mixed units. All you have to do is make sure that you're using them correctly.
Do we know what Russian tankers thought of them when they were issued them? Or did they sort of groan going, oh, wish it was a T-34?
We can all relate to that, but the harsh reality is that, particularly in 1941, you're issued a British tank not instead of a T-34, you're issued a British tank instead of a T-60, or in some cases, no tank at all. There were number of instances where you had a tank unit either with insufficient tanks or with no tanks. And what do you do in that case? Well, you take a machine gun and now you're a machine gun crew. You're not a tank crew. Germans are over there. Enjoy. This policy was frowned upon and officially prohibited by the end of the year just because a tanker is a specialist. You're highly trained compared to just some infantry private that knows which end of the rifle points towards the enemy. Usually, if you got a tank at all and it wasn't some worn out tin can, you're doing pretty well.
When I was thinking of, my father drove Bedford trucks during the Second World War and he didn't like them. And he got issued a Studebaker, those classic Studebakers that the Russians got 100,000 of. And he loved the Studebaker because it had a comfortable bench seat and a heater. He said the Bedford had neither and it was freezing. And I don't know if the Matildas had certain luxuries that perhaps the T-34 didn't have, or if there was not a lot. They were just Spartan and were what they were from the tank crew's perspective to operate in.
They were fairly Spartan. I can't remember specifically whether or not they came with heaters. I don't think they did.
Comfy cushioned seats.
The T-34 seat is it's not that uncomfortable. It is padded. I've been in at the Capel reenacting show. I was a part of the T-34 tank crew. I'm a part of the T-34 tank crew here at the Canadian War Museum. It's not that bad, right? It's obviously a tank. When you have 4 other men in it and all the ammunition and all the equipment, it gets a little crowded. But there's this kind of stereotype that, all Soviet tanks are made for dwarves and all foreign tanks are large and luxurious. If you look at the dimensions and the layouts, British tanks have their own problems when it comes to ergonomics. Particularly height-wise, they're usually fine, but the turret rings are very narrow. And the T-345's turret ring is 1,600-something millimeters wide. And the Valentines is 1270. And the Valentine originally had 2 men in that space, fine. But then the Valentine 3, the Valentine 5 had 3 men in that space. The turret range didn't change. So they were also cramming as much as humanly possible in terms of material and in terms of men into restricted space. It's war. You have to make sacrifices. You're not in a luxury cruise. You're in a tank, and it's going to be crowded, and you're just going to have to deal with that. Generally, the major differences outlined in reports were regarding firepower, which I already covered, regarding mechanical difficulties. So the suspension, the running gear generally got the brunt of the negative feedback. The idlers would jam, and then the tracks would grind on them and become useless. The Valentine, if it hit a mine and the front wheel was disabled, for a T-34, you could just short track it and drive away. You don't even need to be towed. For a tank with a front transmission, find the drive sprocket was disabled, you can short track it, skip the first roller if it was damaged, right? And the Valentine, if you skip the first roller, the whole bogie just taps into the ground and you can't move the tank. So that was a pretty big complaint. Traction, coming back to winter warfare again, every single winter, without miss, somebody would invent spurs for the Valentine tank. They were usually very simple, either welded on. More advanced designs would slip onto the track pin. You would improve traction greatly. You would only need 4 or 5 spurs per track to be able to get out of kind of the icy patches. You don't need spur on every track. And without fail, by the time that this invention kind of makes its way to your commanding officers, they sign off on it, it goes to trials, it passes trials. By the time it's March, all the ice is melted, all the snow has melted, no one cares about spurs anymore, and everyone forgets about it until the next winter, when rather than pulling out the existing design from their archives, they invent it all over again.
But that suggests that, if the last shipment's there in 43, do they see service all the way through the war? Are they still there, right at the end in Berlin in 45? Or have they all packed in? And
they would still be on the front lines. So the Valentine, of course, was a favorite of all British tanks. They only got the last delivery in mid-1944. These were used tanks that were handed over in Iran. I think they were used by the British as a part of the occupation force. And these tanks were all used in the...
We shipped thousands of Valentines, didn't we? I didn't make a note of it, but I'm sure it was more than 1,000 and less than 2, or is it?
3,332 Valentine tanks.
It's a tremendous amount of tanks.
Quite a few. So the Shermans, about 4,000 Shermans were sent. But until 1945, the Valentines outnumbered the Shermans. And you mentioned Canadian output. I also have that number. Canada built 1,420 Valentines. 30 Valentines were retained for domestic service. 2 Valentines were retained by the British for trials, and the rest were sent to the USSR. These numbers will differ if you look at Soviet sources or Western sources, primarily because not every tank that was sent actually made it to the end user. A lot of them sank with their ships. So the Soviets could naturally only count only the tanks that had actually arrived. So their numbers are going to be smaller, but still huge amount of Valentine tanks. Only about 900 Matildas, only 200 or 300 Churchills, but 3,000 Valentines. So they really quite liked them. And yeah, they were in the front lines in 44, 45. There were even some Valentine tanks in use in Manchuria. There were, I can't remember the number, there were double digits, but low double digits, Matildas still on active duty. How much battle these tanks saw, I can't say, probably not a lot. There were also hundreds of them just sort of lying around. A lot of them were in the east because you need to train tankers there. There was still that kind of like, we are at war. Japan is on the side of the Axis. There is a non-aggression pact for now, but look how well that worked out in 1941. We need to be vigilant. We need to train men, including tankers. Train them in Matildas. Train them in old, worn-out BT-7s. And so you start seeing documents around 44, 45 saying like, hey, we have tons of these tanks. What do you want to do with them? They're worn out. We're not importing parts anymore. Generally, what you would do with them, well, during the war, you can't really write them off because it's a tank, it's working. You need to make sure that, unless it's knocked out and destroyed and written off that way, it's really hard to write off anything. But after the war, you would take 3 Matildas, take them apart, put together a working one, and use it as a tractor.
Yeah, I'm intrigued that you mentioned the Americans shipping Shermans. Do you know how the Russians, or if the Russians compared the Shermans with the British tanks? Did they prefer the British tanks to the American tanks? Was there something obvious that the Russians preferred or disliked between the two? Or do they not care? It's just a tank.
There is no one-to-one direct comparison that I've ever seen. The fact that entire Sherman units began to form in 1944, and usually if you had a mixed unit, it would be Shermans and Valentines because they use the same engine. You have this parts commonality. The Valentines were gradually phased out, so you would quite often start with 1 battalion of Shermans, 2 battalions of Valentines, then 2 battalions of Shermans, 1 battalion of Valentines, and finally all Shermans. And then if you had any Valentines at all, they would be in the reconnaissance unit. So Valentine 10s, for example, by the time these tanks began to come to the USSR, this change had already been implemented. And so it was a fairly rare tank, but I think one of the reasons why it shows up so rarely in photos is that they were sent to these units that operated kind of on their own rather than as a part of this big combined arms machine.
Yeah, well, there is that propaganda thing. Why would you show foreign tanks when you show mighty T-34s? So the photographs presumably get disseminated as opposed to people's private snaps.
So the private ownership of cameras in the Red Army was prohibited.
Oh, well, that helps censor photographs.
It's not that they would intentionally try to omit Western vehicles. There's actually a postcard that I have in my collection for the winter of 1941 that has a Matilda in it. Happy New Year, as a Soviet tanker waving to the person reading it. And there's a Matilda in the background. And this was drawn, not a photograph. So somebody intentionally drew a Matilda tank. There are photos, like my book is, my Sherman book at least, is illustrated with period photos. The British themselves had their own censorship rules. They would prohibit the Soviets from publishing information about their tanks in Soviet media. So there was actually a scandal where somebody photographed a Tetrarch and published it. And the Tetrarch at the time was considered top secret because the Germans didn't know about it. And the whole point of the Tetrarch is as a surprise, right? You land this tank in a glider behind enemy lines. They don't know you have it. They don't know, they weren't expecting tanks to show up in their rear. If the Germans find out about it from Soviet newspapers, it's going to be bad. Their surprise will be spoiled, and there you go. So that issue had to be recalled. There was publicity about British tanks as well. So there's a Matilda nicknamed the Tank of 4 Heroes. That's because each member of the crew was a hero of the Soviet Union. And there's actually a photo where all of them are lined up, and there's a plaque welded to the side of the Matilda that says Tank of 4 Heroes. British tanks did show up in this kind of propaganda effort, and they made no secret about it during the war, that the British are helping us, the Americans are helping us. All these posters with, prominently featuring British and American flags. Of course, the Soviet flag is the biggest, but then the flags of the Allies are also shown. During the war, they didn't really make a secret of it. After the war, when political relations cooled, you kind of start seeing this shift in terms of how much aid we want to acknowledge. There's an example I give in my Sherman book where there's a big reference encyclopedia that's simply called Tank. And it's generally apolitical. It's kind of like, here's all the different kinds of suspensions there are, here's all the different kinds of transmissions there are, here's all the motion diagrams, here's all the very, very technical kind of book. There's an intro about kind of how do we get to this point, all the tanks that were used, the kind of highlights. The Sherman is mentioned. The amount of text dedicated to the Sherman is less than 1 page, and there isn't even a photo. There's a photo of, I don't know why they did this, there's a photo of the Chaffee tank on the next page. There's no photo of the Sherman, whether it was kind of an intentional omission or if it was just not really in the public consciousness as a significant tank, I don't know. But that was, of course, after the war. During the war, there was no real secret. There was no real attempts made to conceal the fact that, hey, we have all of these foreign tanks that we're fighting in and, winning in.
I'm curious how you managed to piece it all together. Are you pulling all this information from Russian archives and sources? Which I wasn't sure how accessible those still are.
Yes, so I rely on Russian language archives fairly extensively for my research, which makes sense because, if you're talking about the Red Army, that's where you go. There was a really big wave of declassifications, well, first in the 90s, but then it was less official and more, I have foreign currency. If you would like to look the other way, please, while I go through these files. It was all made official in the early 2000s, and one of the few things I would say the Russian government does well is digitization. Reams and reams of documents are scanned and put online. And of course, you might be worried about censorship. I don't think these documents are being reviewed there's way too many of them. There's just a disclaimer kind of when you go on these sites like, hey, some of these documents talk about people doing war crimes. These were the exception, not the rule, right? Our forefathers were honorable warriors, et cetera, et cetera. The only things that they do censor is the addresses, the home addresses of the people in award orders, but the rest of the documents are entirely uncensored. The real trick is finding what you need, because a lot of the time there is some metadata, but it's not full text search. And yeah, you need to sometimes just say, hey, give me everything from the Ninth Guards Army, right, for this time period, and then just sit there and look at it on the off chance they mention something. And the bigger the unit, generally, the better their record keeping is. One of the biggest challenges for this book was that the British tanks were often used by fairly small units. For example, for the Churchill, the whole Battle of Stalingrad, they don't bother keeping track or keeping records, or if they did, the records have been lost. And there's one report at the end that they write up. That's kind of a summary of what happened. And that's never ideal. But at the same time, the infantry units they were fighting alongside didn't bother mentioning the Churchills at all. So you have to take what you can find. You have to piece it together. And as any historian, if there are gaps or if there's something that doesn't make sense, there's something that you're reading and you think, I got to find somebody to corroborate this because there's no way it actually happened that way. Sometimes you can find other units talking about it. Sometimes you can't. And if you can't, well, then it's kind of the judgment call you have to make whether you include that in your book or write it off as a kind of a hunting story, or just put a disclaimer like, hey, this guy claims to have done this, probably didn't. It works to get across the spirit of the times, kind of like you said. If someone writes, I got onto my Valentine and I killed 100 Germans and I destroyed 10 Tigers and I drove to Berlin all by myself, did that actually happen? Probably not. Does the public remember the Valentine as a war-winning tank, as a tank that contributed to victory? Yes, that could serve as evidence of that. So even these kind of tall tales can still be very useful.
Yeah, it's great. It's fascinating. I just was staggered at how many we sent. And it's completely lost in any sort of British history of the war at all. Let's face it, even the Valentine in British historiography kind of gets overlooked. The Matilda gets a bit of a mention, mainly for being a bit crap, and we got rid of them as fast as possible. But it was amazing how many and it's just completely overlooked.
I think it really depends on when the tank was being used, because nobody likes to remember their defeats. The British, when you think of victorious warfare, right? You think of Italy, you think of Normandy, the Rhine. By that point, the British Army was extensively using Sherman tanks. And so all of these victories are associated with the Sherman tanks, therefore the Sherman tank is associated with winning. Matilda and Valentine, They see most use in 1941, 1942, where at most the British are holding ground. You can't really celebrate, hey, we didn't get defeated that badly this time. It might be a great achievement to put together, a force that can resist an enemy that's trained, that's experienced, and all you have is some schoolboys and farmers and half a regiment of tanks. It really doesn't look that impressive in the long term when it's taken out of that context. In the Red Army is sort of similar when it comes to the Matilda. The Matilda was mostly used in 1942. 1942 is the year of the meat grinder, right? You have the counteroffensive 1941. The Red Army got really optimistic about what kind of offensives it could carry out. And it turned out those optimistic plans did not really always pan out. Plus, the Germans had their own massive offensive plan. They struck Stalingrad. They were coming up on the oil fields in Baku. So this is a summer of positional warfare. This is a summer of, oh crap, the Germans are advancing again. This is the same thing as last year. And Matilda tanks were very frequently used in battle, in these battles that nobody likes to remember. The Valentine was used in 44-45 when things were going much better. And it was also very extensively used in the Caucasus, in the victory, not letting the Germans cross the Great Caucasus Mountains. Those tanks were almost all Valentines and M3 lights, because they were coming up from Iran. The receiving port is right there, right? It makes sense to send them right up to where the fighting is, pretty much next door. And the southern direction was considered to be improbable for the Germans to go into. The expectation was that they would try to attack Moscow again. So there was very little in terms of armor in general, any kind. They needed tanks. The Valentines are right next door. Here you go. They get to be a part of this really big, really famous battle that everybody remembers as a victory. So they kind of earned their fame there. Does that mean that the Matilda was a worse tank? I think we can all agree that it was, but sort of it also got the short end of the stick when it comes to publicity, because you can't really point to any battle and say the Matilda won this battle, but you can do so for the Valentine.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. Yeah. In my mind, the Matilda is what we had in Britain when we're on the back foot, and then suddenly all these Germans arrive and we win. Which is a very unfair way of looking at it, but it's kind of how the British. So you think of the desert, we were just waiting until the Grants arrived, and then the table started to turn, and then it turned on the taps. We had the Shermans, and we started winning. Yeah, it doesn't reflect on British tanks very well, more on how many we had.
The Sherman made its debut in the Battle of El Alamein, the Second Battle of El Alamein. If they had no Shermans, and instead of those Shermans, they had Grants or Matildas or Valentines, I don't think the battle would have drastically changed. The outcome would have drastically changed. So it is a part of these tanks came at a very opportune time, right? That doesn't mean they were bad tanks. They don't deserve their glory. It's just that sometimes the timing doesn't work out, and you really have to get deep into the weeds. And your layperson, who watches History Channel documentaries might never find out about the great achievements that these tanks had on the battlefield.
Very good. Well, thank you, Peter, for joining me and helping uncover the story of British tanks in Soviet service. Loyal listener, if you would like a deeper dive, do check out Peter's book, British Tanks of the Red Army. And if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, you can find me at Patreon, patreon.com/WW2podcast. Your support really helps keep the podcast running and allows me to keep bringing you more interviews and deep dives into the Second World War. Well, that is it for this episode. Next time, we'll be exploring Robert Capa's iconic photographs captured on Omaha Beach.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.